Antonia, let us know when you think it's time for us to start.
We are on the hour now, so it's a good time to start.
Okay, looks like, okay, all right. Well, welcome everyone to our session. Good afternoon. My name is Amy Foster Wolferman, and my colleague Debra Hallos here and I are going to be talking with you over the next hour or so about a social emotional learning curriculum that we developed called Bounce Back for Classrooms. And we're pretty excited to have this resource completed and ready for use. We've had piloted it in a few different settings now, and so we're quite excited to have this opportunity to share a bit about it with you all today. And so Deborah and I both work with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. Next slide, please. And our trauma center, NNCTC, it's an organization that's housed within the College of Education at the University of Montana, in Missoula, Montana. And our current center was founded in 2007, and it was based on some grant funding we received from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And when we received this funding, we then became members of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And it's there that we operate as a Category 2 training and technical assistance site. So our primary focus in our work is to really support tribal children, youth and families who've been impacted by trauma, and then those who serve them. So we really do work in a number of different agencies. Juvenile justice is one, but we also work with schools, mental health agencies, law enforcement, medical facilities, and we also work with families and communities at large. So our work takes us all across the country in both rural and urban settings, and we strongly believe in working closely in partnership uh, alongside our partners using a collaborative approach to supporting the healing of trauma. So at this time, I really would like to share our university's land acknowledgement statement. So the University of Montana would like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. Today, we have the honor um, of Oh, sorry. Today, we honor the path that they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. So, on a personal note, I live here in Missoula, Montana, where our center is housed. And I come to this work having been previously a teacher, a special educator. I worked in early childhood settings as well as elementary, middle, and high school settings. And I worked as a consultant for schools in implementing positive behavioral interventions and support models and practices. So currently, most of my work has to do with supporting schools and becoming more trauma resilient. And that's on multiple different levels, so school-wide levels, classroom-based levels, and also at the individual level with students and youth. I live here in Missoula with my husband and my two teenagers, both of which are off to college. It's a new chapter in our lives, and like to hike quite a bit with my dog. Although currently we have a lot of smoke and heat, so we're hiding out indoors just to stay away from that. Hopefully, it'll run its course pretty soon and very quickly. And I want to mention that we have staff all over the nation. So we have staff many who live in their own home tribal communities. So folks in Minnesota, South Dakota, several in Oklahoma, Arizona. Um, so we are kind of span multiple states. And at this time, I want to pass the introduction over to Debra so she can share a little bit about herself before moving on.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. I'm Debra Hallos. Thanks so much for joining us today. I work along with Amy at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I am the interventions manager, the clinical consultant. My background is in mental health. I've been a licensed therapist in the state of Montana for over 20 years. My work with the center has focused on writing and adapting clinical interventions and social emotional learning curriculums. I also work, as does Amy, in helping systems become more trauma informed and have a special interest in bridging mental health and education. I live in Montana. I'm not quite in Missoula. I live near the capital, Helena, Montana, in a little neighborhood that borders the Montana Forest Service land. And so we are keeping some pretty good tabs on the wildfires here. Otherwise, it's a beautiful place to live and be. I have 4 emerging adult children, a couple that are still in college and a couple that just graduated. And I guess I look forward to sharing more about this curriculum that Amy and I co-authored. So again, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Deb. And we don't have the time to go around and have everyone introduced, but we'd love to just hear from you maybe in the chat, um, who you are and where you're from. It'd be great to get a sense of that. So thank you for joining us today. And Deb, can you go to the next slide? So we've been really fortunate, and we feel honored that we've been able to work with and partner with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. And together we've formed this Tribal Youth Resource Center where we support work that's related to integrating trauma-informed approaches and practices in tribal youth programs and also in tribal juvenile healing to wellness courts. And so we do this through training, and we also work on projects um, with our staff and the TYRC TLPI staff on developing things like trauma-informed assessments for different programs and different court processes. So it's been a real pleasure to work with the folks at TLPI, and we've been doing this for about 6 years now, and so we do hope that we can continue this partnership. They've been able to uh, provide us with a sub award through grants that they receive from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So we look forward to this continuation. Next slide, please. We do have to mention too, because the funding for this work comes from OJJDP, that what we're sharing today may not reflect the opinions, the findings, recommendations, and conclusions of the Department of Justice. So I just want to note that and note that we're fortunate to have received funding from them. So next slide. So in this next hour or so, we're going to begin with a very brief overview of trauma and its impacts, just to create a common starting place and language around this topic. We don't know what everyone's background knowledge and experiences with the topic, so getting us on the same page before moving forward to talk about the Bounce Back for Classrooms curriculum that directly relates back to what trauma is and how it impacts. And so we'll do that. And we'll also talk about how this particular curriculum can fit within a larger trauma-informed setting, such as a school or other kind of child-serving agency. So that's our little roadmap there. Next, please. So the Bounce Back for Classrooms it's a social emotional learning curriculum that we would consider a trauma-informed social emotional learning curriculum. And it was developed based on an intervention called Bounce Back, which is a small group therapeutic intervention that can be conducted in school settings with a mental health professional. And it's really aimed at supporting youth who have, one, been exposed to trauma, but also who are experiencing symptoms because of that trauma. And we just really do need to be careful about not making assumptions that when youth or people have particular experiences that they go through, that it's necessarily going to have a long-term negative impact. So we don't want to assume trauma with just based on events that people have gone through. So it's important to look at the impact and how it affects our youth. So most of the bounce back intervention is focused on psychoeducation and skill building. So it helps youth understand that sometimes difficult things that we might experience in life can impact us in different ways, and that it's actually very common to experience a number of these different kinds of reactions. And so it teaches also that if these symptoms start to get in the way of us being able to do the things that we want or need to do in life, that there are things we can do to cope and to feel better. So the bounce back intervention is therapeutic and does include some processing of one's own trauma narrative, but the bounce back for classrooms that we're talking about today, it's not therapeutic. It's not a therapeutic intervention. Those pieces have been removed, and so it's just the knowledge and skill building pieces that have been maintained. And so we have taken those and also then adapted them to fit into a format of a social emotional learning curriculum so that a facilitator can pick it up and easily um, conduct or facilitate lessons. So, all in all, there are 12 lessons, and we'll go through what the lessons look like here shortly. But each lesson is broken into an average of 2 skills per lesson, and with each skill, we first explain the skill. So, what is the skill? What's the rationale? Why do we need to know about this skill? And then we provide an opportunity to demonstrate so that the youth can see the skill being modeled before they then get a chance to practice the skill. And then with each lesson, we have a transfer of learning activity so that we really help to encourage that, making that connection between what we're learning in this setting, whether it's a school or some other um, agency, that those skills can then be transferred to real life. Um, yeah, so that is in a nutshell, and Deb will tell you, take you deeper into the curriculum as we move forward. So next slide, thank you. So again, we're going to take a few moments to talk about some of the basics of trauma to create that common language. And this is a definition that comes to us through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And it's one that's commonly used by mental health professionals. And it says that trauma is this experience of a real or perceived threat to one's life or to our safety or to the life or safety of a loved one. And this experience can cause an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, helplessness, or fear. And in that moment, our brains and bodies just automatically react to this threat by going into a fight, flight, or freeze reaction or mode in order to protect ourselves from danger. So this is just this amazing survival skill that all of us humans have. And one of the important pieces here in this definition is the experience of a real or perceived threat, because it's not the event itself that is traumatic, but the way that we experience the event. So, two people might live through the same event. So, let's say it's a car accident, and they may experience it very differently. So, if I experience the car wreck as a threat to my life or safety, and I'm overwhelmed with fear and terror, then maybe I have experienced this as trauma. Whereas maybe Deborah, who's in the passenger seat, might have believed that we were never in danger and never felt those overwhelming feelings of fear and terror. So it really was not traumatic for her. So it's just good to keep in mind that what might be traumatic for one person might not be for another. It's not the event, but the way that we experience it. The other thing is that experiences of trauma also include witnessing a real or perceived threat of to life or to the safety of a loved one. And so just witnessing it can be just as traumatic as directly experiencing it. That's kind of the overall definition of trauma. Next slide, please. There are a number of types of trauma. There's different categories. So we can look at trauma in terms of those acute experiences where it's a one-time event. Some of these acute traumas might be a violent incident, an accident. Maybe we've experienced severe weather, a sudden loss of a loved one, but they're typically traumatic events that happen one time. There are also chronic types of trauma, and these are those multiple experiences of trauma. So, not just experiencing a violent incident, but also experiencing the sudden loss of a loved one and also experiencing witnessing domestic violence. So kind of multiple layers of different types of trauma. Chronic trauma can also mean one type of trauma that is repeated, such as ongoing neglect or different types of abuses. And then complex trauma includes chronic trauma or those multiple or repeated types of trauma, but with the addition that the trauma typically begins early in one's life as a child, and that can really impact or disrupt the typical development. And then it also often occurs by one's caregiver. And so that really further complicates the impact, especially in relation to about being able to develop trust and safety and to attach to other people. There's also historical trauma, an important type of trauma, which is often the context of many of the contemporary and current types of traumas that we see in our communities and those that we work with. Historical trauma we'll talk more about on the next slide, but it's the wounding experience of historical events, such as genocide, that get passed on from one generation to the next. Um, And then the last type of trauma here on this slide is secondary traumatic stress. And this is a really important one to pay attention to as service providers. And it's that impact of working with others who are experiencing trauma and how that could impact us. So over time, with this kind of exposure to other people's traumas, we can actually start to develop similar symptoms of traumatic stress to those that we are supporting. So it's an important one to pay attention to. And all of these kinds of traumas, although they impact us, trauma is very treatable. And so I think there's a lot of hope in this work as we're exploring what trauma is, how it can impact, and then what we can do to help. Next slide, please. Um, so with thinking about historical trauma, you may be familiar with the work of Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She is a Lakota psychologist, researcher, and professor. And she first coined the term historical trauma among North American tribes. And she began her work there by looking at Jewish Holocaust survivors in World War II, the research around that, and how several generations after the Holocaust, descendants who hadn't directly experienced the Holocaust were still showing similar symptoms to those of the survivors. And these symptoms were related to post traumatic stress disorder or traumatic stress. And she then applied this concept to her own Lakota people and found something very similar based on the traumatic events that her tribe, as well as other tribes in North America, experienced. And so we all know Indigenous people in North America have experienced tremendous losses and trauma over the course of several hundred years, and including events like genocide, forced relocation from homelands onto reservations, forced assimilation, including boarding school experiences where children were removed from their homes and subjected to abuse, policies that prohibited tribal spiritual and cultural practices and the speaking of one's own language, and just ongoing racism and stereotyping. All of these events and experiences have had long lasting impacts. And so Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart, she defined historical trauma as this cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group traumas. And we see this all across the globe. There are a number of different examples of historical trauma, of course, with our Indigenous North American populations, African Americans, the experience of slavery in the United States, forced relocation to internment camps of Japanese Americans over in Europe, of course, the Holocaust, but also colonization of Celtic peoples. So there's certainly examples across the globe. Um, but it's important to understand that historical trauma is only historical in the sense that the traumatic events originated a long time ago, but those events left unaddressed continue to impact people and communities. And historical trauma is often an underlying cause for current conditions in many of our communities. And it's certainly something that can be overcome, but we need to first recognize what it is and how it has affected us before we can move beyond it. And many of our communities, as you know, are doing just that. They're bringing back cultural ways of healing, strengthening connection to culture, supporting the development of healthy Native identities in our youth, learning tribal languages. So, really revitalizing cultural ways of being, which is helping our communities overcome the impacts of historical trauma. I think it's an important context to be aware of in our communities. Next slide, please. I just want to start, are there any comments or questions at this point yet? All right. So taking us now to the individual level, the impact of trauma, there are a number of ways that trauma can impact. So if you look at these different realms, so physically, how does trauma impact us? We might experience somatic symptoms like headaches and stomach aches and dizziness. Um, we might become hypervigilant, so we feel like we are constantly on guard, looking out for danger that could occur any moment. We might really struggle to fall asleep at night. And we might do whatever we can to avoid anything, people, places, things that remind us of the trauma that we experienced because it's just so uncomfortable to think about and to feel. Um, Mentally, we might have intrusive thoughts about the trauma, and they can be very difficult to stop or control. It can make it really difficult to be able to concentrate and to be present and engaged in the moment. We might start to develop unhelpful thinking patterns. So, viewing the world as now this unsafe place, everyone is dangerous, everyone's out to hurt me. So, have these kind of negative thinking patterns, always expecting the worst thing to happen. We might feel at times like we're actually reliving the trauma that we've experienced, and we might not want to think or talk about it just to avoid those memories. We might also believe that the trauma that we experienced maybe was our own fault. And so we might be walking around with feelings of guilt. We might think that, child might think that if they were experiencing physical abuse by a caregiver, that maybe they deserved it, that they were a bad kid. Um, when we're experiencing trauma, we might feel like we're in survival mode and we're just anxiously awaiting the next thing. So we're anxious and worried and fearful. We might try to escape these feelings by avoiding reminders and checking out the, to the degree that we might feel numb, right? So a lot of um, our youth turn to substances to help them feel numb and not have to be reminded of the trauma, feel those feelings. We may have very intense feelings that just uh, come to us out of the blue. All of a sudden, we may not really understand what we're feeling or where it's come from, and maybe how to regulate those feelings. And then spiritually, we might begin to question our beliefs, our religion, the creator, God. We might wonder how a higher power like this could allow these kinds of traumas to happen. So we might stop attending religious gatherings or ceremonies when we might start to feel disconnected from what we once felt a part of. So maybe we once derived a lot of joy from being out in nature and feeling a part of something larger than ourselves. And then after experiences of trauma, we don't feel this connection any longer, but we feel more isolated. So these are some of the common symptoms of trauma. We may experience some of them, we might experience many of them. They may fade away over time naturally because we are resilient as human beings. But sometimes we get stuck in these symptoms, and that's when we need to really be concerned about stepping in, getting some help for people who may need it. And these are the kinds of the symptoms that Bounce Back for Classrooms was built around. And so helping with emotion identification and regulation, identifying unhelpful thinking patterns, and understanding different ways of coping and gaining some self-control. All right, next slide, please. So there are two frameworks that we like to use to help define a trauma-informed school system. And one is the 4 Rs developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And what they had done was taken a group of trauma survivors, trauma practitioners, and trauma researchers and said, what does it take for an organization to best support those that they serve who are impacted by trauma? What helps? And so they came up with the 4 R's, and the first is realize. So in a setting like a school or a youth serving agency, whatever your program might be, all staff realize the pervasiveness of trauma experienced by those that they serve. So they understand how common it is amongst the children, the youth, the families, even themselves and their colleagues. It's also it's a very parallel process. We're not just serving others; we are human beings ourselves, and so it's a self-reflective process as well. Um, Staff also then recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in those that they serve, so they understand some of the behaviors that they may be seeing on the surface um, might be ways might be trauma symptoms that are coming out in their actions. And so we develop what we call a trauma lens. And then the system responds by intentionally integrating trauma informed practices and interventions that help to mitigate the effects of trauma. So, best practices, and we'll talk about what some of those look like, and then actively resist re traumatizing those that they serve through their policies and procedures. Maybe taking a look at the impact of some of detention rooms or timeouts and how that sometimes has the opposite effect that we want it to. We can be re traumatizing our youth. Um, we may escalate a student's fear response through harsh disciplinary practices. So, really noticing that and changing the way that we provide our services. So, then the other aspect that we draw from, the other framework that we draw from, is the multi tiered systems of support, public health model of prevention and intervention. Schools have adopted this often around preventing problem behaviors. So, positive behavioral interventions and support is one way that this model is used. And it's really just looking at it's a way to organize different practices, different curriculum that we use, different interventions that we can provide those that we serve. Um, Here's kind of an example of how it's been used in different communities. So let's say we have a public health issue of heart disease. And so to prevent heart disease in a community, we might educate everyone at this tier 1 level, this is what we call the universal level, about how exercise and good nutrition can reduce your risk of heart disease. And in addition, at this tier 1 level, we might promote healthy eating and exercise through a lot of different community events and activities. So these prevention efforts might be helpful enough for most people in our community to prevent heart disease. And by engaging in them, we're preventing more people from needing higher levels of intervention. But some people might need a little extra support to prevent heart disease, and they might need a special medication that they take regularly in addition to the good tier 1 nutrition and exercise. Um, so it's this combination then of tier 1 exercise and nutrition plus a little extra help, the medication. Um, and this tier 2 uh, should be accessible to those who are at risk for heart disease. And then finally, at the tier 3 level, there might still be a few people that, in addition to all of the um, healthy choices and the medication, they might need more individualized or intensive interventions, such as the surgery, heart surgery. So this is kind of a way to look at then how we apply different practices in our settings. So if we're trying to support youth impacted by trauma, everyone can learn about the impacts of trauma and stress and how to develop healthy coping strategies. So we teach all kids at the tier 1 universal level. Some kids might still need a little extra support or practice with being able to apply these skills. And so an organization might also have small groups that get together to practice these skills more frequently, and they might incorporate a more therapeutic approach to help them process with a mental health professional. There'd be a difference between tier 1 that everyone gets and tier 2 is that little bit of extra support. And then tier 3, a youth might need something more individualized, just based on maybe a treatment plan to support them and how to deal with their trauma. So there's different levels and layers of support. But bounce back for classrooms, was designed as a Tier 1 social emotional learning curriculum as a way to teach all students some basic knowledge and skills. And by doing that, following the logic of an MTSS, we're really reducing the number of students that need additional, more intensive levels of support. So I like to use that framework. Next slide. I also want to mention, I think we want to mention these frameworks and approaches just because if all we do is focus on teaching our youth these knowledge and skills around trauma, and yet our setting, we don't set up in a way that is supportive, we might not get as far or be as helpful if we don't address um, also the environment and the way the adults interact and support our youth. So these are important. In addition, are trauma-informed principles and approaches. So one of the key trauma-informed principles is around developing an awareness of trauma. So again, we call this that trauma lens. So when, for example, a student is in a school setting, is experiencing a trauma reminder and they shut down and become unresponsive, we can better understand that they may be acting this way based on some trauma symptoms, right? Instead of assuming that they're being disrespectful or non-compliant, we might see and understand that they're acting based out of fear, and maybe they're trying to seek safety or avoid danger, and that's what their behavior is about. So this understanding can help us lead us to better response practices, and also we can understand how to better prevent situations like this. Knowing what kids' trauma reminders are can be really helpful. So another key principle is safety. Um, so our youth impacted by trauma, they're often walking around in this highly stressed survival mode, and they're feeling fearful and worried and anxious. And so creating safe spaces where youth know what to expect in terms of routines and expectations, how adults are going to respond to them and treat them. All of these things can help our youth to feel safe and kind of let their guards down a bit. So safety is key. Another one is empowerment. So often our youth impacted by trauma can feel like things just continue to happen to them, and that they have no real control over their lives. And so we can help them build back their sense of control by giving them choices, really listening to what they have to say and validating what they share with us, and just letting them know that who they are, what they say and what they think matters, and that what they want for themselves and what they dream about for their futures can happen. So really trying to lift up and empower our youth that often feel like they have no power or that it's been taken away. Um, and lastly, here, we a trauma-informed principle is taking a strength-based approach. So our youth impacted by trauma sometimes feel maybe damaged, like something is wrong with them, and they may develop a lowered self-esteem. So it's really important to highlight what it is they can do and what they want to do more. So then, rather than we want to focus on what they're good at and what they want, more so than continuously correcting the things that they may struggle with, right? So we also a piece of this just is really to share the message that we believe in them, that they are capable of being successful, and to help instill that hope. So these are all some general trauma-informed key principles in supporting our youth. And then the next slide, please. So just want to share a few of the strategies that also fit within that tier 1 level of support. If you think back to the triangle, the base are the universal strategies or mostly prevention strategies. So this is again where Bounce Back for Classrooms fits in. And these other strategies or approaches are recommended that adults use with youth just to help create environments where they do feel safe and where they do feel empowered and maybe a sense of control. And so these strategies are best practices not only for kids impacted by trauma, I think those kids need it the most, but they're strategies that are good for all kids. So one is having a clear, and I think you have to click each one of these in, Deb, if you don't mind. So one is having a clear expectation to help youth know what to expect. They can feel more at ease. The other is directly teaching social skills like understanding feelings and how to cope with them. Again, this is where Bounce Back for Classrooms fits in. Providing praise and encouragement to help focus youth strengths on their strengths and to help them to build their self-esteem. We also want to take a non-punitive approach to discipline and consequences. Um, and really, this is about um, teaching our kids what to do instead rather than just teaching them what not to do. We want to build their skill set and uh, really work to not re-traumatize or remind kids of traumas that they've experienced, and sometimes more harsh disciplinary practices can do that. And they're not as effective as an educative approach to consequences. So we also really want to work to understand youth behavior, realizing that what we see on the surface typically has underlying reasons. And again, our kids are often trying to avoid danger and trying to seek safety. We also want to work as a team. So when we're struggling to understand what might be going on with the youth, pulling in people to work together to problem solve. What do you know about this child? What do you know about this child? Let's bring in the family. Let's really work together and not just try to um, do it on our own. Consistency is another piece. We really want to have everyone in the setting be on the same page about these practices that we're going to intentionally integrate. Um, and let's see, Deborah, are those coming in? Those bullets? Oh yeah,
Yeah,
thank
I'm
you.
sorry, Amy.
Okay.
I thought I had put them all up on the screen. Does everybody see the bullets on the screen?
Yeah, sorry, I see it now.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Um, and then we can't say enough about how important developing those positive, nurturing relationships are, because there's so much healing in that, where youth can feel like they're connected to someone, they are valued, and that someone's there to protect them. So we just can't say enough about the healing that creating those positive relationships can do. Um, and all of these things really work to create a safe environment. In addition, we want to encourage our adults to really notice their own emotional states and work to sort of model self-regulation, keep the calm, and model that for their youth. Um, and then it does take that whole school or organization or program approach, from the drivers to the administrators to the youth workers, whoever it might be, really getting everybody on that same page. So these are just some examples of strategies that we can use with all kids that are particularly helpful for our youth impacted by trauma. And in addition to directly teaching the youth skills from this curriculum that we're going to share, we really want to be working on creating a setting that is safe and supportive. So I want to keep that in mind whenever we think about adopting curriculum like Bounce Back for Classroom. And I think that's it, Deb, for that section.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
So I have the opportunity to take you through the Bounce Back for Classrooms a little bit more for the remainder of our time. We wanted to share a little bit with you about our thought process for developing Bounce Back for Classrooms. And really, it's just from a need of to address trauma in child-serving organizations. And we know that 2/3 of children will experience a traumatic event by the age of 16. And in schools and child-serving organizations, we have access to children, right? So if they're coming to our school every day or coming to our program every day, we have access. And it might take away some barriers like financial barriers or transportation barriers. So we know there's a need to address this in child-serving organizations. But we also know that there's a need for interventions. We did a study at our center in 2012 where our partner sites screened middle school students. And what they found from that screening is that over 70% of the middle school students endorsed violence or trauma exposure. Another screen was for trauma reactions, some of those trauma reactions that Amy went over earlier. And we found that 57% of students, middle school students, endorsed trauma reactions, and 47% endorsed both, which is an indication that they need an intervention. Now, evidence-based targeted interventions like Bounce Back, the intervention, or cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools are wonderful, and there's a lot of efficacy behind them. But the limitation is that they only reach a small number of students. Typically, the group counseling setting is between 8 and 10 students. So we know from the screenings that we've assisted in and just working with child-serving organizations over the years, that there is a need for that universal strategy to reach all students, for all students to gain some skills and knowledge. I wanted to mention that I think the information that Amy presented was so important because we would like to see Bounce Back for Classrooms be implemented only as a small part of a trauma-informed school. It is written as a universal strategy, but during implementation, those facilitating might identify that maybe students need more. Maybe they do need a targeted intervention. Or we need to access those multiple tiered levels of systems and supports. So we established that there is a need for Bounce Back for Classrooms, a social emotional learning curriculum. And it's an important piece, but just one piece, of a trauma-informed school system or a trauma-informed child serving system. So in addition to following evidence-based practices for treating trauma, we also wanted to make sure that Bounce Back for Classroom was in line with best practices of social emotional learning. And we looked to CASEL for guidance. So CASEL is an organization, and it stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And they've done a lot of work in understanding how social emotional learning can benefit children and development. They have I think a nice and comprehensive definition of what social emotional learning is. And that's the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So I like to read it out loud because in reading it out loud, I think it really underscores or really enunciates the need for this often missing component in schools and child-serving organizations. It's a very important piece of learning and development for children. So CASEL addresses 5 broad and interrelated areas of competencies. And those competencies are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And then they broke down those 5 areas even further into the core social emotional competencies that we see on the screen. So we wanted to make sure that our learning objectives and Bounce Back for Classrooms reflected these competencies. And so as you can see, we put that on the screen just so you could compare many of the skills and knowledge that we're working with in Bounce Back for Classrooms not only are beneficial for managing, mitigating, and treating trauma, but they fall within these competencies developed by CASEL. And I think it's important because many schools, or many state core competencies utilize CASEL. In fact, here in Montana, the Office of Public Instruction utilizes the CASEL core social emotional competencies as their competencies for their whole child skill development. So we wanted to just make sure that we are in line with some best practices of social emotional learning. So as Amy mentioned, Bounce Back for Classroom is an adaptation of Bounce Back the Intervention. Part of our work in the network is we've had the opportunity to work with some extraordinary people. Two of those people, Lisa Jaycox and Audra Langley, who developed Bounce Back, were willing to work with us to create Bounce Back for Classrooms. So we really felt like the intervention lended itself to a curriculum where you could take out a lot of the skill building components and activities and create them into lesson plans. We also worked hard to make sure that it's not psychotherapy. It is based upon cognitive behavioral therapy components, but it's not intended to be therapy. It's intended to be therapeutic in nature. So we took out those pieces that might increase student vulnerability or risk and really focused on teaching skills and knowledge. This slide represents our goals, right? So we're hoping to decrease some of those effects of traumatic stress, some of the common reactions that Amy identified earlier, while at the same time increasing coping strategies so that we can create a sense of hope and healing for children and can build up their resiliency and capacity. So in providing psychoeducation on trauma reactions and the body's danger response, we hope to help children feel validated and understood. By encouraging the utilization of support systems, we're hoping to decrease the feelings of isolation that children may have, especially those who experience trauma. Self-care strategies, relaxation, and self-regulation skills help to decrease common reactions in children, those feelings of anxiety and hypervigilance. Experiencing trauma can increase the frequency of anxiety, provoking, and inflexible thinking. So the curriculum aims to challenge these unhelpful thoughts and replace them with more flexible, calming, and helpful thoughts. Just checking the chat. This next slide provides an overview of lesson 2. So we wanted to show an example of how the lessons were designed to be flexible and work within various settings and timeframes. It was originally written to work in education settings, but we do believe that in other child-serving organizations, this curriculum could be applicable as well. So the scope and sequence of lesson 2, as you can see, is broken down into 2 skills. Each of the skills follow that explain, demonstrate, and practice structure. And the skills, after the skills are taught, there's a transfer of learning that ties in the threads of learning, the threads of the skills and knowledge. Each skill, each part of the skill, there's a time frame associated with it to give you an idea about how long it should take. But with that being said, we know that some settings might not have a full 50 minutes, and they are designed to fit within a 50-minute structure. So it makes perfect sense, and it's very acceptable to break the lesson up into skills. So one week you might tackle skill number 1 and get through the 3 pieces, and then the next week finish up the lesson with the second skill. We also know that students and children, they learn at different rates. And so we want to empower facilitators to use their skills, their relationship skills, their teaching skills to gauge with their students the level of learning. So sometimes the time frame might be off in that it takes more time. You need to slow down to really help a student understand the concept that's being taught. Sometimes there are issues that come up, whether they're behavioral issues or transitions, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get through the activities. All of this is perfectly acceptable, and so you could go at your own pace by working through skill to skill if need be. So we wanted to develop a framework that was as flexible as possible. We have learned from our pilot sites that some of the younger kiddos, especially those in 2nd and 3rd grade, it takes a little bit longer to get through the material. And so that's where we would recommend breaking up the classroom time into skills versus lessons. So let's talk a little bit more about those components of Bounce Back for Classrooms. Group lesson 1 and 2 are introductory. So time is spent setting the tone for the curriculum. We want to let children know that they're not expected to share personal stories. In fact, if they wanted to reach out and talk more, we'd encourage one-on-one sharing and establish a plan for them to do so. Should their peers share any personal information, we address confidentiality by defining it and demonstrating what that looks like. This is part of the transparency and establishing safety is really helping students to understand what's going to happen in this classroom, how it's going to go, and letting them know that there are people that care about them if they want to share more information, and having a plan for them to do so, while at the same time releasing them from any expectation to do a lot of self-disclosure publicly in class or in the setting. We also introduce the body's danger response. So we might explain it like this. Let's say a bear walks into the room. What might be happening? What might be happening to your body? What might you be feeling, right? Some people might have their heart racing or sweating or tingly sensations in their fingertips. Right? What might you be feeling? Some people might feel terrified or scared. And what might you do? Some people might choose, if it's a black bear, especially, to try to fight it. Others might try to exit the room, and others might still try to hide or freeze. And that's the body's danger response, that fight, flight, freeze response. And it's part of our survival mechanism. So we'll spend some time going through scenarios and playing a game called the fight, flight, freeze response that helps kids understand that body's very natural way, that danger response, a very natural way of trying to keep us alive and safe. But we also want them to understand that at times we could have false alarms go off. That is, our body and minds are reacting to a situation as if there's danger when there actually is not danger present. And sometimes when experiencing a very frightening event, we can develop reactions that last long after the danger has subsided. Right? And those are those common reactions to stress and trauma. Sometimes we refer to them as normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. In Bounce Back for Classrooms, we use a book entitled A Terrible Thing Happened by Margaret Holmes, which is a very good book. This is a book designed for children who witness violence or trauma. And it's about Sherman Smith, the raccoon, who saw the most terrible thing happen. So the book demonstrates in an empathic way many of the common reactions we can experience after witnessing traumatic events, such as not wanting to think about what happened, having problems eating and sleeping, having problems concentrating, getting in trouble at school. The book instills hope and promotes utilizing resources. So that helps to explain the purpose of the Bounce Back for Classrooms curriculum, and really normalizes any reactions children may be having to frightening events. Part of the introduction is also introducing the feelings, thoughts, and actions triangle that we'll use kind of as the crux of the curriculum. So this looks, those of you familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy see that this is very familiar to the CBT triangle. This is not a pure CBT intervention. It's not intended to be, but we are using components of the CBT triangle because we know that it's effective in working with trauma, helping people recover from trauma. And this is what it looks like. So let's take a closer look at the triangle, right? There's the three sides: feelings, thoughts, and actions. And our feelings, thoughts, and actions are interconnected. If we alter one, we can alter the other two, and they also support each other. So let's take a second to demonstrate this triangle. If you would like, you can certainly respond to my questions in the chat, and it might be more fun for everyone. But I'm going to give you a scenario, and we'll go through the triangle. Let's take a scenario that a lot of people can relate to, and that's public speaking. So let's say that you're tasked with giving a large presentation at work, right? And maybe you have thoughts like, oh no, right? Not me, not me. I'm hoping I hate public speaking. I'm hoping I don't humiliate myself. But it might be some other thoughts people have if they know they have to give a big presentation at work. And if you'd like to put that in the chat and play along, it'd be great. What might be your thoughts if you're told by your boss that you need to give an important presentation for work? Thank you. I really don't want to do that. I can't do this. My thought is often, I hope I don't embarrass myself. So if your thought is, I can't do this, I don't want to do this, I might embarrass myself, what emotions might that evoke? Again, if you'd care to share in the chat, that would be wonderful. Someone put that they're too scared to do this. You might feel really scared. I just want to take the day off. So maybe there's like that sense of foreboding, right? So if you think to yourself, I can't do this, and you feel really scared, what might your action be? Someone might just take the day off, right? But what else would be your actions if that's going on in your triangle? Any ideas? I don't want to do this. I feel scared and nervous. Maybe a little sick to my stomach. You could just call in sick, right? Great. Who hasn't done that? Somebody might run away. Okay, but let's just take a different look at it, and let's change up the narrative somewhat. Okay, so what if you had more helpful or calming thoughts? Like, what if your thought was, I've gotten through public speaking before. Yeah, it's not my favorite thing, but I've been able to get through it before. But most people don't like public speaking. So if I mess up, maybe they'll be understanding. So these thoughts, like if you were to have these thoughts, what might be the emotion? Might it change your emotion ever so, like take down the edge, if you will, ever so, to help you feel a little bit more calm or confident about giving the presentation? So a lot of positive self-talk might help us feel a little bit more confident and help us do a better job. Now, it's harder to come up with those more calming thoughts if maybe we've had some pretty bad experiences in public speaking, right? Makes it a little bit harder to come up with those thoughts. And so trauma and stressful experiences can also really impact our feelings, thoughts, and actions triangle. But in Bounce Back for Classrooms, we use some skills and strategy to manage that, and students will have the opportunity to regulate their emotions, challenge unhelpful thoughts, and then problem solve and think about actions that are proactive and helpful. We'll spend quite a bit of time with students, helping them understand this triangle, and then it will be the same visual that comes up lesson after lesson. And what we've heard from folks who have implemented is that a lot of students love the triangle, and it's a little bit of an aha moment for them that they're able to connect, that their feelings, thoughts, and actions are connected. Because you know what? When we understand that, it increases our empowerment, that we can alter our emotions, our thoughts, our actions somewhat to feel better. So another component piece of Bounce Back for Classroom is on identifying and regulating feelings. In fact, lesson 3, 4, and 5 focus on identifying and regulating feelings. And the skills taught in these lessons are helpful for all children, but they're especially helpful for children who have experienced trauma. If a child is growing up in an environment that's maybe chaotic or unsafe, they might not feel like they have the opportunity to adequately express their emotions. Maybe it's not safe to express their emotions, so they end up stuffing those emotions. Maybe they have had difficulty, or they have difficulty picking up on emotion from others, or they're hypersensitive to anger or someone's tone of voice or facial expression. And they might have feelings that are out of control, just really big, strong feelings, more so after experiencing a traumatic event. And so these lessons are really designed to help children self-regulate. Some of the skills and concepts that we teach, a lot of the games, activities, and discussion in these 3 lessons, they help children to understand emotions in themselves, what could be bringing on emotions, where emotions show up in the body, and how to measure their energy or intensity of emotions. And it also helps them to understand other people's emotions, to pick up on others' emotions. We have on this slide a little thermometer, and that's a big piece of our skill development, is helping kids measure intensity of emotions, right? So this is a scale of 10 to -1, with 10 being very high and 1 or 0 being very low. And then -1 is about being checked out or dissociation. So in Bounce Back for Classrooms, when we talk about feelings, we also talk about numbness, which is frequently overlooked in other programs that talk about feelings, just because that numbness, that not wanting to feel, not wanting to think, checking out or dissociating is a very common reaction amongst students who've experienced trauma. And so there are things that we can do. We might not always have control over our emotions, but we can shift them. So if we have a very high level of anxiety, it's a very intense, there are things we can think about or things we can do to bring it down so it's more manageable. There might be times where students are not able to focus or checked out. Then there are things that we could do, things we can teach those kids so that they can come back to grounding, taking some deep breaths, coming back to reality, if you will, so they're better able to be in the moment. Some of the self-regulation strategies that are taught include belly breathing. So belly breathing are those deep diaphragmic breaths, right? And so when you take diaphragmic belly breathing breaths, your body almost has no choice but to slow down and rest a little bit. The technique we could use, instruct kids to use their hands or maybe a stuffed animal or small ball. We'll have them put one hand on their chest and one hand on their diaphragm. If you want to do this with me to experience diaphragmic breathing, I can take you through it. We instruct kids to take a very deep breath, so deep that they can feel their belly move up and their chest move up at the same time. We'll have them take a deep breath in, hold their breath, and then let it out. And as they're letting that breath out, they can see their hand or stuffed animal move. So it's a deep breath in and out. So we'll practice belly breathing throughout our lessons. Another common self-regulation technique is what's called progressive muscle relaxation. And so I think we have some time that I could take you through a quick progressive muscle relaxation activity. But first, what I would like everyone to do is check in with yourself to see where your energy level is. Where's your energy level right now on a scale of 10 to -10? Excuse me, on a scale of 10 to -1. So 10, 9, and 8 would be very high energy. 4, 5, 6, 7 in the middle, 2, 3, 4 pretty low, and 0 or -1 is maybe you've just checked out. So everybody take a minute and either jot down your energy level or put it in your mind. And next we'll do just a quick progressive relaxation. Now, keep in mind, this exercise is designed for elementary students. I'm gonna lead you through it, and I hope you do it with me, but be prepared to be a little silly and use your imagination. It's all about engaging your imagination. All right, so I'll ask students to take a deep breath in and out. I'll explain that we're going to be going through a series of flexing and relaxing the muscles in our body. Well, let's start by grabbing on some lemons. So I want you to pretend that you have 2 lemons in your hands. And you're squeezing those lemons as tight as possible, hoping to get some lemonade juice out of there. Squeeze really tight, tight. Okay, drop the lemons and shake out your hands. All right. Okay, let's grab the lemons again. Tight, tight fists with the lemons. Okay, drop them. And take a second to shake out your hands and arms and feel that your hands and arms are a little bit more relaxed. Now I want you to imagine that you're a lazy, fluffy kitten laying around in the sun, and you decide to take some stretches. So you put your arms out in front of you, all the way up, and then down. All right, let's stretch again, kitty cat. All hands out, up, and then down. All right. Next, I want you to imagine that you're a turtle sunning yourself on a rock, right? Just minding your own business. And uh-oh, here comes danger. So now you have to get into your shell. So pin your shoulders up against your ears. Try to hide in your shell. Oh, hang out there, hang out there. Okay, phew. Danger's gone. Come out. Relax a little bit. And uh-oh, the danger's back. So go back into your shell. And then relax. And when you come out of your shell, take a second to roll your neck and make sure that your body's nice and relaxed. One other little progressive relaxation exercise is, let's imagine that you're at the beach and you have your feet and toes in the warm sand. The sand's a little bit wet, and you grab the sand with your toes, squish it in your toes, take your heels and make little indents in the sand with your heels. Feel how nice and warm that is. Take your feet out of the sand and shake them off. And the last one is my favorite. Pretend that a pesky fly lands on your nose. And without moving your hands, try to get that fly off your nose. Okay, phew. The fly's flown away. Now you can, done a great job, and now you can take some deep breaths. And just be aware if you have any tension in your body and shake out those pieces. All right, well, so that's the progressive relaxation technique that we use with kids in Bounce Back for classrooms. Those of you that participated and took your energy reading, please take your energy reading again now on that same scale of 1 to -1. And just see, maybe for some people, they've had a chance to calm. Maybe it's decreased their energy somewhat. Sometimes for people, progressive relaxation helps them focus a little bit more. And maybe for some, it had no impact. So that was the feelings side of the triangle. After kids have had the opportunity to learn some self-regulation skills and identify feelings, we'll dive into thoughts in lesson 6 and 7 to help children understand their thoughts and manage unhelpful thinking. You know, as we said before, children who have experienced trauma might have a tendency to jump to worst case scenario in a situation. They might have a tendency to disqualify the positive and only focus on the negative. They could have a tendency to think of things as all or nothing, either good or bad, right? Well, these type of thoughts can increase anxiety and worry. And so we'll spend a lot of time helping students combat those unhelpful thoughts with more helpful, flexible thinking that we call courage thoughts. So courage thoughts are those thoughts that is positive self-talk. So it could be like, I can do this. I got this. It's not the end of the world. Maybe thoughts that help students think about things in a different way. Like, is there another way of looking at this? What are the other possibilities? Okay. Even if the worst case scenario comes about, how can I make a plan of action? What are the facts here? Okay, so it's the method of second guessing unhelpful thoughts and trying to identify thoughts that are more accurate, thoughts that are more calming, thoughts that help us regulate in a way that we can be proactive. So on the screen, we have one of our illustrations, and it's the young man with 2 thought bubbles, right? This is an activity we call the double bubble. So on the one side, students would write in like their first thought, like it was an anxiety and helpful thought, and then they'd replace it with their courage thought or a more helpful thought. So I'll ask you to do this as well. Think about the last time you've had a thought that was anxiety provoking, maybe needlessly so anxiety provoking. Maybe it was worst case scenario. Maybe it was a thought that kind of made you feel like down or depressed, but a thought that wasn't all that helpful. So if everybody can think of an unhelpful thought that they've had recently, could jot it down or just keep that in the forefront of your mind. So for me, an unhelpful thought that I often have to challenge is when someone's late, especially one of my kids, late coming home or late coming to visit. I automatically jump to, okay, you know, they've had a car accident, and then I'm in some sort of panic, right? So to challenge myself, I might consider, you know, what are the other possibilities? Well, if it's my daughter, Courtney, she's always late. She's never not late, right? So maybe they're falling behind. I might check the facts and be like, well, you know, no one's called me saying that there's an issue. You know, I can follow her Life 360 app and see that she's moving down the road. So we really want kids to get in the habit of thinking about things in multiple ways and really fighting the tendency to jump to worst case scenario, or one of the thinking errors that occurs commonly with children who've experienced trauma. So again, back to you and the double bubble, right? So if you felt, can think of an unhelpful, anxiety-provoking thought that you've had, or an inflexible thought, I want you now to challenge that thought with something that is more flexible or helpful by thinking about other possibilities or checking the facts or finding a positive piece of what happened. Another important area of bounce back for classrooms is helping children to identify their resources and seek out resources, and also take some time to focus on problem solving and conflict resolution. I think these are good skills for all kids to have, right? To identify your resources, feel comfortable seeking out help when you need it, and also working on conflict resolution. Kids who've experienced trauma might need just a little bit more help because they may have not had that experience of having conflict management modeled to them. They could be a little bit more on the impulsive side. So it's about helping them stop and think about their actions. There are a couple different activities that we use in helping students to identify their resources. We read the book, The Invisible String by Patrice Karst. The Invisible String is about a family where it's identified that we have connections with people, and even if we can't see that person, they're not right there, we can feel that connection in our hearts by an invisible string. And we have invisible strings to many people, whether it's elders who have gone before us, our grandparents, people who have passed away. It could be a pet. It could be a connection to a place. So it's helping students identify through activity who it is, those people in their lives that support them. Another activity used is Who's on Your Team, where they take some time out to think about who they can turn to in various settings. So the school, community, and home. And then we spend one full session on helping to manage conflict and increasing social problem solving by helping students understand or come up with an array of brainstorming things they can do when their feelings thermometer is rising. That is basically when they're upset or frustrated. And we take them through multiple scenarios and role plays where they can practice using different behaviors and action. So it's a bit of action planning, really teaching kids the basics of the problem solving method, of thinking about possible solutions, the pros and cons of all those possible solutions, and then identifying a solution that at least doesn't make the situation worse and could make it better. Built in the Bounce Back for Classroom curriculum are multiple opportunities to review. We're working with elementary age children, and it's important to review. Here's some examples of those reviews. Midway through the curriculum in lesson 8, we'll do a treasure hunt with kids where they have the opportunity to practice skills. They go from station to station practicing these skills, and at the end, of course, is a treasure. In lesson 11, they build what's called a feelings, thoughts, and actions toolkit. So thinking about all the skills they learned to take care of their feelings, to manage their thoughts, and to decide on appropriate behavior. There's a collective poster that kids work on where they share what they learned in class, what their favorite thing about class was, and what they're going to keep practicing. And then in lesson 12, it kind of wraps everything together where children have the opportunity to participate in small group presentations to either lead a skill or talk about some knowledge that they've gained. As with any curriculum, we think it might be important to evaluate it. So we developed a Bounce Back for Classroom student knowledge and skills survey. The first half of this survey is multiple choice and true false to test knowledge. The second half is asking kids how much they've engaged in the skill on a Likert scale. This survey can be given pre and post. So we'd recommend allowing students to complete the survey before the lessons begin, and then 1 week after lesson number 12. You could then look and compare the results pre and post to determine whether or not they've increased their knowledge or whether or not they're practicing the skills. So if you are interested in implementing Bounce Back for Classroom in your school or in any of the child serving organizations, it's just a simple matter of speaking with Amy or myself. Just go ahead and email us. We'll set up a call to see if it's a good match, if Bounce Back for Classrooms would be a good match within your organization. We can provide the training and material. We are funded by multiple sources to work with schools and child serving organizations for American Indian youth and Alaska Native youth. And I would love to spend some time if folks have any questions, and why we are fielding questions. I can put my email and Amy's email up so that you can contact us if you are interested or if you have more questions about the curriculum. All right, so please, if there are any questions, go ahead. Questions or comments or concerns, please put those in the chat.
We'd also be interested in knowing if folks are thinking this might be something you'd be interested in implementing with your youth that you support. So love to hear that too, if you would be willing to share. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for attending.
I know there's also an evaluation that Antonia will be posting in the chat. I think it's a pretty brief poll. Thanks, Dana. Where are you located?
Right, in Fort Hall.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful. We'd like to talk with you more.
We were there. We were there. That's right. I'm putting your name together. Alana, is the curriculum done throughout the school year, or how long does it take to get through everything? And we designed it so that you could potentially do, there's 12 lesson plans and you could do one per week. But we've found that in some cases, if you don't have enough time to get through one lesson, you might have to break it apart and do, so that might extend it a little bit longer. So it really depends on kind of your setting and how much time you have. Thanks, Beth.
If you are implementing in a school, we'd recommend that you start earlier versus later, just to make sure that you're able to get through all the skills and all the lessons.
Yeah, and do feel free to email us. We are able to travel and provide training, and with the training, we also deliver all of the materials electronically. Sometimes we do them in person, sometimes we do them virtually. Depends on what works best for folks.
And I forgot to mention, Amy, we are gauging interest, and oftentimes we'll have a multi-site training where folks from multiple sites can either come to Missoula to attend the training, or we could do it virtually as well. And then that way you have a cohort of people who are also trained in Bounce Back for Classrooms if you wanted to kind of seek guidance from a group of people. And Alana, to answer your question, I do think it's possible to implement outside of the school, and I be happy to talk with you more to see if it's a match or if there's a way of making that structuring so that that could happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to reinforce, it's not a therapeutic intervention. It does not need a mental health professional. It also does not require a teaching certificate. Um, just we just need people who are comfortable supporting youth in learning social skills and teaching about emotion. So people with that kind of skill set, but it can be in different organization types that serve youth.
Hello, everyone. While we continue and asking and answering questions, I'm going to launch the end of session evaluation. Please take at least 2 minutes to take this evaluation. It really helps us plan future online learning events.
One other thing to share here is that what we focused on today was the Bounce Back for Classrooms curriculum that is really designed for children in around the second through fifth grade age period. And the next week, we'll be providing a training on a similar curriculum, student trauma and resilience, that Debra Hallos developed here. And that really is for middle school and even high school age youth. So two different curricula focusing on these different age levels. So if you're interested in the one for the older kids, you might join us next week. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time out of your day.
Great.